message, and I'm personally very interested to hear to Dr. Thompson for his speech on this subject. Now let me give this floor to Dr. Thompson, please. Go ahead.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I'd also like to thank the Abert Foundation, which I understand is the co-organizer of this event. So to both organizers, my thanks. I understand as well that you have another seminar tomorrow, and that it's on the uncontroversial topic of North Korea. So I realize that this is just a warm-up, and Southeast Asia may not be on people's minds quite as much as North Korea is at the moment, which is familiar to me. I live in Hong Kong, and of course, in Hong Kong, people tend to have three things on their mind in terms of countries and regions. First thing, of course, is China. The second thing is China. The third thing is China. So whenever I talk about Southeast Asia, people's eyes tend to roll over a bit. The third qualification is that in my studies of Southeast Asia, and we have a Southeast Asia Center, and actually Hong Kong is a very interesting place to study Southeast Asia because of its proximity to the region, but also the international character of the city. There are particularly large numbers of Filipinos and Indonesians living in Hong Kong, and migration is an interesting issue. My focus is mostly on comparative politics, but I was told here there's more interest in international politics, so this is a little bit of a foray by me into international politics, and you'll see how I'm trying to combine international relations with comparative politics. So I am, in a disciplinary sense, also sort of switching sides. So if my international relations theory seems a bit thin to some of you who know more about these things, I'll be grateful for your comments. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about how some of the internal dynamics of some of the most interesting regimes in the region interact with the two external players, with China and with the US. And I'll go through these slides rather quickly because I think it'll be interesting to get your feedback and your comments. But I'll try to cover a fair amount of ground in this short period of time. This direction. Okay, maybe I'll just raise my hand. I'll do it in this direction. There are two stories that I'm trying to bring together today. The first story concerns the great power competition, which is heating up, obviously, in Asia generally, but in Southeast Asia in particular, and of course the long discussions that have been going on for quite a while now about whether China's rise will indeed be peaceful. On the other hand, the phrase, the pivot to Asia by the US, although the US is sort of disavowing this phrase clearly, the Obama administration has tried to put more emphasis on this, even though events in the Middle East keep pulling them back into other concerns. Obama's recent hosting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN leaders, in California, in the same location he not too long ago hosted the Chinese leadership, suggests the kind of prioritization the US is giving to this region. The second story concerns political transitions, and they are quite remarkable, particularly Myanmar's recent political fairy tale. For anybody who thinks good things can't happen in the world anymore, the dark clouds are gathering, look at Myanmar. It's a happy story in which a brave woman, Aung San Suu Kyi, having been under house arrest for decades, the opposition repressed, somewhat miraculously emerges as a political player as the regime liberalizes the military regime, which seemingly was so brutal in its repression, now opening up, and there were recently elections that most observers consider free and fair, despite some ethnic insurgency still raging in the country. So that's quite a fairy tale. And since there are some German speakers here, and many of you will know Grimm's fairy tale, which have less happy endings generally, that would be the story of Thailand. seemingly happy tale about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, when they had a relatively peaceful uprising which led to the end of a brief interim of military rule and the establishment of seemingly stable electoral democracy, further consolidated by a new constitution in 1997, then this recent military coup in 2014. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And finally, leadership changes in Vietnam, very interesting. They got quite a bit of publicity, rightly so in my opinion, in January. And political changes in the Philippines, which will occur again after the election that's upcoming this May. But are these two stories related? And if so, in what sense are they related? How can we look at military rule in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, and Thailand, and their respective relations to China and the US? Likewise, does Vietnam's struggle have anything to do with this external power competition, or vice versa? Does that in turn influence the leadership struggle? Or in the Philippines, the very interesting differences between the previous administration, the administration of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and the current administration of Benigno Aquino, known as Noy Noy. Has this also been something that's been affected by this larger external environment? Well, clearly China has been courting military rulers, and of course not just in Southeast Asia. More generally, of course, authoritarian regimes have tended to find a friend in China, which does not look at a regime and judge it, as they claim the West tends to do, but rather is open to a regime regardless of its human rights record. By contrast, of course, the West, recently anyway, in the post-Cold War context, has expressed scorn for military rule. So the contrast is quite obvious. And therefore, it's not surprising, as Myanmar was isolated in the repression of 1988 and the elections which were held but then ignored in 1990, which the opposition won, that isolated from the West, Myanmar, the military rulers of Myanmar turned to China. And also, not surprisingly, given the political changes, the coup that occurred in May 2014 in Thailand, those military leaders have also been courted by China and been very open, of course, to those advances. The US and the West generally, I think it's fair to say, love civilianization, even if it's important to stress that civilianization does not necessarily mean the establishment of what one could reasonably consider democracy. And I said the post-Cold War era, but actually you can go back a little bit further to the Carter years of the 1970s, and then after a bit of a change of policy under Ronald Reagan in the early 80s, by the late 1980s, the Reagan administration was also pursuing a policy in which even if countries were formally allied or informally allied with the US, there would be pressure on human rights, particularly regarding military rulers. Therefore, no big surprise, of course, that Myanmar is isolated by the West, by the US in particular, and the scolding the US has given to Thailand in a number of formal and informal contexts follows this pattern, of course. Likewise, the civilianization of Myanmar that began in 2011, actually arguably a little bit earlier when the military passed its constitution. At the time, no one took this new constitution very seriously because military rule was still quite repressive in Myanmar, but it turned out to be the beginning of a process that has led to civilianization. One interesting point, though, is that the US and the West generally turn to Myanmar even before it's clear this is going to result in democracy. It's enough that it appears that the country is heading in that direction, and it shows that by jumping the gun, of course Obama went to visit Myanmar twice already, it's showing its keenness to get involved even if the political situation is uncertain. And once Aung San Suu Kyi at least once had to scold Obama and said, we don't know yet if the military will actually relinquish power. And still, as I speak here today, the outcome of this process is unclear, although I think grounds for optimism do indeed exist, even if reserve powers of the military are still there. So you see military rulers in Myanmar switching sides. Just the background is, actually military rule goes back to 1962. Actually to 1960, a brief coup returned power to civilians. Then 1962, the country pursues an isolationist, pro-socialist policy, although non-aligned, not allied with the Soviet Union. That model collapses also economically, and there are major protests, as people remember, in 1988 that are brutally suppressed. As I mentioned, a lost but ignored election in 1990, which the opposition wins, and then the boycotts by the West, and then the changes, particularly since 2011. Sorry, the slide got covered over here. That seems fairly clear, and it also seems clear why Myanmar would turn to China, and China would, of course, be interested in working with Myanmar. And in fact, for a better part of a quarter of a century, China was one of Myanmar's best friends, without doubt. And without China's assistance, the regime would have had a hard time surviving politically, but also economically. And there was, in fact, modest economic growth for much of this period. And of course, the top brass didn't do too bad themselves. There was quite a bit of enrichment that went on during this period. But it turned out that this embrace had its drawbacks, particularly in terms of the dependence on China. And if you bear in mind the fact that Myanmar had been politically independent or neutral in the 1960s and 70s through the 1988 protests, then the clear dependence on China was a source of concern, not only to society as a whole, and the sense that, national sovereignty was somehow threatened, but within the regime itself, where there were strong nationalist elements. And there was this sense that, well, we need China, we can't survive without China, but actually we don't like to be so dependent on it. And more than perhaps most places where you have perhaps a more pragmatic stance, given the Myanmar's past experience of neutrality, that was particularly difficult, I think, both for the regime and society generally. In addition, there were particular projects. There was a dam project that became very controversial as the regime started opening up a bit. Protests emerged around these environmental issues initially. That's an additional push for the regime to change policies a bit and cancel, for example, this particular dam project, which of course angered China. And there were also border conflicts. And there was the sense that China was not playing a particularly constructive role and letting rebels escape into China and so on. And there were suspicions within the military regime, to be fair, also on the Chinese side, that there were being, that rebels who were ethnic Chinese were not being treated fairly. That was the Chinese perspective. Likewise, the Myanmar military government was concerned that these rebels were able to escape military attacks by escaping into China. Myanmar has been civilianizing as part of long-standing constitutional planning. The opening toward the West has indeed paid interesting and significant dividends. The political recognition, the visit by a U.S. president, the foreign aid, the role of NGOs is growing. I don't think these things can be underestimated. Foreign investment, according to recent figures, has already quadrupled. It's still a very small amount, of course, compared to most countries, but by Myanmar standards, which for years have been isolated in a very poor place, quite significant. And tourism is up as well. In fact, land prices have soared in Yangon and some of the other urban centers. So clearly there's kind of a mini boom going on in Myanmar, and that has a lot to do with moving toward the West politically, and that, of course, also eased economic integration. The price, however, the military regime has paid internally, of course, is that they've had to hold these fair elections, and that they, much to their surprise, lost them. Very interesting, if you look at the results of the 1990 elections and the elections in 2015, they're virtually identical. So for those of you familiar with some of the discussions about Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, whether communism had profoundly transformed societies or just frozen them, and then when they re-emerged after 1989, some of the political configurations were similar. This certainly seems to be true of Myanmar, because the party, the National League of Democracy of Aung San Suu Kyi, won virtually the same percentage of the vote, got the same number of seats. Also interesting that they never bothered to change the system, the electoral system, which favored the party which won the most votes, and therefore the military, even though it won over 10% of the vote, got a lower percentage of the seats. It had, however, some guaranteed seats, the 25% here. It also has representation in national and regional parliaments, controls national defense and security, and its its economic influence is very unlikely to be challenged. It's clear that in some of the informal negotiations going on, that Aung San Suu Kyi has been reassuring her new military friends that her government would not touch their economic strangleholds. And in fact, of course, either members of the military or cronies closely associated with them are dominant players in the economy, and also those profiting most from the current opening process. Turning to Thailand, a little history here. Military intervention goes back to 1932, but most significantly was the coup of 1957. There was a second one in 1958. And that coup established what today is understood to be the network monarchy. This is a phrase that's become quite common in academic usage, where you have an alliance between the monarchy itself, which is much more influential than it was in the period prior to 1957, and this influence has been growing steadily. Of course, officially Thailand is a constitutional monarchy, although some of the wording suggests it's not. But in practice, most observers believe that the role of the monarchy goes much beyond the kind of constitutional monarchies you see in Europe, for example. Likewise, the military can legitimate itself by invoking the monarchy, and that's very clearly seen in the current coup, where the role of the king in legitimizing this coup has played a central, has been center stage. How enthusiastic the king actually is, we don't know, of course. He hasn't spoken openly. He's quite ill, as is his wife. That's another issue, and one reason why this military government probably wants to control things as tightly as it does right now, because it wants to manage this very difficult succession coming up once the king dies, which could be, of course, any day now, given his fragile state of his health. Civilianization occurred in 1988, and then again after a coup and an uprising in 1992 that was strongly supported by the U.S. In this post-Cold War environment. But the U.S. has been critical of a series of coups against pro-Thaksin. Thaksin Shinawatra, most of you will know, was a very important, remains an important politician now living abroad, who basically revolutionized Thai politics with what's often, and I think accurately called, populist appeals, pro-poor programs, universal health care, assistance to small villages, small loans, and a series of other measures that came later, also under his sister, Yingluck Shinawatra, a rice subsidy program, which was a great help to farmers, but the military shut down and said was wasteful, and accused her actually of graft in that regard, and she's still on trial for that. So there was a coup in 2006. I would argue there was another coup in 2008 covered up by a formal transfer of government within parliament according to procedures, but behind the scenes the military had pressured and wooed one particular faction of the Thaksin coalition, and that led to a change of government, which was widely seen in Thailand to be illegitimate, not following normal political rules. So it led to anger. Thus the protests in 2010, some of you will remember that in Bangkok in May, the crackdown that led to about 100 deaths, quite extraordinary in a major capital in Southeast Asia. The military would be shooting people. It was quite a gruesome scene. And then the most recent military coup in May of 2014. As I mentioned, of course, the military didn't wait long to make overtures to China. Relations with China had been good, but of course they got much closer after the military took power. The concern of the Thai generals was Thaksin's electoral monopoly. He was able to win elections repeatedly. He, as I said, transformed Thai politics because he had this link, this electoral connection to the poor voters, particularly in the north and northeast. He himself comes from the north. Although from a rich family, he's a political outsider, and it was very threatening to this military monarchy network. And that's why, another reason why the coup occurred, and the way, this is one of the euphemisms, as you may know, the lèse majesté laws in Thailand are quite strict, so people talk in many indirect ways about the looming succession due to the king's fragile health, and that's one way the actuarial moment. The turn to China can be seen as part of a longer-term strategy by the regime, not just politically as Western support is withdrawn, but also because Thailand needs a new source of income generation. Its economic model has really not been successfully revived since the Asian financial crisis. Thailand has grown at relatively low levels, but most economists agree it's stuck in the so-called middle income trap. So they're hoping through these closer ties with China to increase trade and tourism, which has in fact happened. Now Chinese tourists are the most important numbers of visitors to Thailand. For investment, there's a big infrastructure project, a big rail project that they've agreed to. Nonetheless, the need for Japanese investment in particular, but also U.S. military aid remains, and that's a problem. And the slogan that China and Thailand are friends and historically have been close has not received widespread support. In fact, there's a sort of a informal discourse among Thais complaining about Chinese influence, particularly complaining about Chinese tourists. This is something I'm very familiar with in Hong Kong as well. Oh, okay, sorry, just one slide before this, yeah. So anyway, just to sum up, so the embrace of military rulers by Thailand, by China, sometimes, however, that embrace can seem too strong, as in Myanmar, whereas in the early stages of the courtship, to stick with that romantic metaphor, it's quite welcomed, as you see, among military leaders in Thailand. The West increasingly feeling, as a matter of principle, it has to distance itself from these military regimes, and that provides a certain incentive to regimes such as Myanmar, particularly if they feel like their ties to China perhaps too one-sided, to open up, and that has had, in fact, economic benefits. Likewise, the opening to China has at least initially had some economic benefits. So besides the political aspect, there's also the promise of increased trade investment with whichever side you had not previously been so close to. Okay, next slide. So I move on to Vietnam. And one of the issues that came up in this leadership struggle, which was generally portrayed as either generational or a struggle between hardliners and softliners, reformists and conservatives, was which faction was pro-China and which was not. And one of the narratives you do see if you look at some of the articles that have been written about this in the popular press, and some academics take this view as well, is that the conservative faction, the faction that's not anti-reform but more cautious about economic reforms in particular, not to mention political ones, is more pro-China. Whereas the reformist faction, the more pro-capitalist one, was anti-China, and that's due to a major speech made by the leading member of this faction. The party chose stability and also therefore chose to maintain its admittedly tense but its relatively strong ties with China. The background, of course, is this. Vietnam is, as a regime, basically the same kind of regime as China. It's a former communist regime, still officially communist regime. Now one of my colleagues at City University, Jonathan London, refers to these kind of regimes as market Leninist, not Marxist-Leninist, because of the role of markets, but the continued importance of Leninist political control. So in that sense, Vietnam and China are very similar. In many ways, what Vietnam has done is imitate China's reform process, maybe a time lag of 5 to 10 years. Likewise, of course, China is a useful partner because of the pressures that Vietnam fears from the West concerning human rights issues and so on, which have mounted recently in Vietnam. There's also a major exile community which has a big influence on Vietnamese politics. So there's an unease in Vietnam about the role of the West, not just governments, but also civil society groups. And the similarities in the economic system, but of course then this national concern, the conflicts that have even turned violent recently between Vietnam and China over oil drilling rigs and so on. Nonetheless, it's very interesting when you look at other recent articles and other academic analyses. In fact, it's the other way around, that it's the other faction, it's the conservatives who are actually, at least behind the scenes, more anti-China. I was planning to go into some detail about this, but I think the important point is it's not clear there is any pro-China faction in Vietnam. In fact, both sides probably are competing with each other to make sure that they have the sufficient nationalist credentials to lead Vietnam. Because I think the party is clear that if anything could bring them down, in the near future anyway, it's the sense that they're too dependent on China, that they're bowing to China's will, and you know, talking about a political trajectory. I mean, Vietnam's history is one of the strongest nationalist movements anywhere in the world, taking on some of the world's great powers and defeating them successively. So for such a country with such a proud record of national sovereignty, won at a great human cost, to kowtow to China, if you'll excuse the phrase, that would be political suicide. So I think it's clear that there are going to be continued tensions between China and Vietnam, and likewise there will be an opening for the West, despite the still relatively repressive political system between Vietnam and the US and other Western powers. Turning to the Philippines, this perhaps is the least well-known story that I've been telling here. There was an administration of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo who was in power from 2001 to 2010 under somewhat dubious circumstances. Her predecessor had been overthrown, even though popularly elected. A populist not that dissimilar to Thompson. She then faced a legitimacy crisis, particularly as Estrada, her successor, had been overthrown. His friend and fellow movie star politician, Fernando Poe Jr., whose daughter is now running for president. Now, if that all sounds very complicated, that's Philippine politics for you. Lots of dynasties. I've studied Philippine politics for many years, and I find myself, sort of going through family trees and sort of figuring out, because it's often people are quite closely related to each other. After cheating, basically, this candidate, Fernando Poe Jr. in 2004, that cheating became evident, and when a tape emerged of her talking to one of the election commissioners saying, "Did you get my 1,000,000 votes?" That discredited her, and even though she survived, there were a number of coup attempts, and she faced a grave legitimacy crisis. And during this period, she was seen as having turned to China basically because she wanted investment, she wanted money, and there were huge corruption scandals around these deals. And the sense was she was getting money from the Chinese that she could use for her own political survival, because she had a lot of people to pay off in the military, political elites, and so on in order to stay in office. Even the Catholic Church was accused of taking fancy cars from Arroyo in order not to criticize her too much. So what you got in the 2010 election, where Aquino was elected, is a discourse about how Arroyo had sold the country out. And she had abandoned Philippine interests in the South China Sea to China in order to secure her own political future. And therefore, one of the sometimes neglected elements of the Aquino administration was its strongly nationalist stance, its even confrontational stance toward China. It seems a little bit of a, to use the biblical metaphor, David and Goliath situation that a country like the Philippines would take on China. And I think the Chinese are quite surprised that such a, not a small country, but relatively poor and weak country would dare do that. And they see, of course, the U.S. hand behind it, the U.S. colonial tradition in the Philippines, the close alliance that still exists between the two countries. But the background in the Philippine context is that Arroyo was unpopular. She was seen to have sold out the country, and Aquino could cement his position not just as a political reformer, but as also somebody who's upholding Philippine sovereignty and finally confronting China as it needed to be confronted in terms of the South China Sea issues. The cost, of course, was a major loss in Chinese investments. Tourism was down. In fact, there was a temporary ban on tourism for a while during some of these conflicts that have come up from time to time. The Philippine economy didn't suffer because it had other revenue streams, particularly a lot of foreign workers and a very fast-growing business process outsourcing, BPO sector. Call centers in particular, Philippines has a lot of English speakers that they put to good use in this new industry. So the Philippine economy has grown quite rapidly. It's some of the highest growth rates. So their loss of Chinese investment, their loss of trade and tourism with China has not hurt Aquino enough. Nonetheless, some of the candidates now running are saying, if we repair ties with China, or at least take a less confrontational stance, we can gain some economic benefits as well because of the trade and investment that so far have been withheld. So I've already basically talked about this, that Aquino is seen as very pro-US, and in the Philippine context, given the history of American colonialism, there is a strong nationalist tradition. You would think that that would make Aquino quite unpopular. I was very surprised. I studied at the University of the Philippines, which is known to be a bastion of nationalism. There are few intellectuals there criticizing Aquino for his pro-US stance. The US is being led in the back door. The US used to have huge bases in the Philippines. They were kicked out in the early 90s, in part because they backed Marcos for all those years. The sense was the Philippines was finally free of this neo-colonial influence, and a lot of scholars agreed with this, and they thought this was a new chapter, and now all of a sudden the US is being invited back in. Regular military visits, and even though we're not bases formally, there are strong US ties. The Supreme Court has now gotten rid of the last hurdle to this, and my point is the nationalist critique is rather muted because the fear of China is so great, and there are a number of scholars, Philippine scholars, who spend a lot of their time just warning about China and the need to take this tough stance. So the political environment in terms of external relations has shifted dramatically in the Philippines. The nationalist critique of close ties with the US has faded as the concern about China increases and the need to, pragmatically anyway, be close again with the Americans. Okay, this slide I can also skip over. The weakness of Arroyo, her lack of legitimacy, was one reason she was close to China, so her critics, whereas Aquino, a relatively successful president in terms of popularity, in terms of growth rates, in terms of at least providing the image of a reformer. Whether things have actually changed that much in the Philippines is another issue about which I'm a bit more skeptical, but clearly he was a much stronger president and could afford to take this stronger stance against China, which at least for a while paid off politically too. Okay, so there is a major switch going on in Southeast Asia, not just internally in places like Myanmar or Thailand, or partially in Vietnam and the Philippines, but also in terms of shifting alliances. And great power alignment and regime change have been related. One factor, for example, that is often mentioned in terms of Myanmar's changes is the sense that if Myanmar wanted to become less dependent on China, it would need to open politically. Now, there are a lot of factors that are used to explain this quite surprising and, as I say, fairy tale-like change in Myanmar, but I think the argument can be made that this was, in fact, a significant aspect of the military's motivation in opening up, civilianizing, and now seemingly moving towards some sort of electoral democracy. Likewise, in Thailand, there was the sense that there was a need to court China in order to survive politically, but also to jumpstart the economy, and that seems to have paid off for the Thai regime as well. So while the Myanmar regime has benefited from its ties to the West, so Thailand, at least in the short run, from its ties to China. There is, despite strong interest that might lead you to think that China and Vietnam would be more closely allied, this nationalist issue is so strong that Vietnam retains its distance regardless of which faction is in control. And in the case of the Philippines, it's, I think, likely that the next president will take a somewhat softer line toward China. I think Peking will probably be seen as the high point, the most confrontational stance the Philippines can take. I think given the Philippines' geographical situation, given its the potential benefits of closer economic ties with China, really doesn't make sense for the Philippines to take such a confrontational stance. And I think our new president is likely to back down. That's what I want to say for now. Thank you very much for your interest.
Very interesting and stimulating. expose. Now we'll have a Q&A session, and those who have a questions, please raise your hand and state your name and organization. Yes.
So, I'm Mr. Rigger from Inha Law School, and I would love to ask you a question, in fact two questions. What do you think about Laos and Cambodia?